December 4th, 1950. Police officers storm through the gates of a remote Greek monastery in the dead of night. What they find inside will shock the entire nation. 36 malnourished children, dozens of half-naked elderly women tied up in basement cells, and evidence of the most twisted religious scam in European history. And the woman behind it all? A sweet-looking nun who called herself Mother Mariam. She systematically tortured families into signing over their life savings before slowly starving them to death. She would lock people in cells where tuberculosis patients had died, feeding them just enough to keep them alive while they signed legal documents transferring their property to her name. Once the paperwork was complete, she'd cut off their food entirely and watch them waste away. Her method was simple but brutal. Psychological torture through isolation, physical torture through beatings, and finally death through starvation, all while wearing the sacred robes of a holy woman. But why would a nun be this brutal? What could possibly drive someone who took vows of compassion to commit such unspeakable acts of cruelty? Well, it all started in 1883 Greece, where a little girl named Marina would learn that survival meant being more ruthless than everyone around her. Marina Soulakiotis was born in 1883 in rural Greece, into a family so poor that some days, breakfast simply didn't exist. Picture a teenage girl waking up before dawn, her stomach empty, walking to the family farm where back-breaking labor awaited her until sunset. The factory work that followed wasn't any easier, just different kinds of suffering for pennies that barely kept her family alive. But Marina had dreams that stretched far beyond the dirt under her fingernails. She wanted wealth, she wanted power, and she was willing to do anything to get both. Growing up in extreme poverty does something to a person's mind. While other children played, Marina calculated. While others dreamed of love and family, Marina dreamed of gold and control. The constant hunger, the endless work, the humiliation of being poor in a world that valued only money, these experiences were carving something dark and twisted deep inside her soul. At 23, Marina made a decision that would change everything. She chose the one path available to a poor Greek woman that could lead to power. She became a nun. But this wasn't about finding God. This was about finding opportunity. Now, here's where things get interesting. Because the man who would become her mentor was about to hand her the keys to something much bigger than a simple convent. Matthew Karpathakis was the head monk of the Old Calendarist Church when Marina first approached him. But Matthew had problems of his own. He was feuding with church leadership and planning something revolutionary, his own breakaway monastery. When Marina joined his cause, she wasn't just becoming a nun. She was becoming a co-conspirator in what would become one of history's most elaborate religious scams. Together, they founded the Convent of the Virgin in the Pines in 1927. But here's the thing nobody understood at the time. How did two people with no money suddenly acquire multiple plots of expensive land? How did a poor farm girl and a rogue monk build an entire monastery from scratch? The answer would later send chills down investigators' spines. Marina, now calling herself Mariam Soulakiotis, had discovered something powerful. People's faith could be weaponized. The monastery was advertised as a healing center for tuberculosis, a death-sentence disease in those days. Desperate families brought their dying loved ones to this remote mountain location, believing divine intervention was their only hope. What they found instead was a place where medical treatment was forbidden, where patients were crammed into single rooms, and where the only doctor allowed was one who signed death certificates. But Mariam was just getting started. As Archbishop Matthew aged and began his spiritual isolation, spending 40 days fasting and wearing heavy metal chains, his young apprentice was consolidating her power. And when Matthew finally died, Mariam didn't just inherit his position, she inherited his victims. The sweet-looking woman in nun's robes had finally achieved her lifelong dream, complete control over life and death. But what she did with that power would make even hardened detectives lose sleep. Miss Michalakou received her tuberculosis diagnosis like a death sentence. But when she heard about a monastery offering treatment, hope flooded her heart. She arrived expecting spiritual healing and medical care. Instead, she was thrown into a cell and left to die. No medicine, no treatment, Just a few tiny meals that barely kept her breathing while tuberculosis slowly destroyed her lungs. She died alone, in agony, without a single loved one by her side, exactly as Mariam had planned. This was Mariam's most profitable scheme. Over 150 people died this way. Families would bring their sick relatives, pay everything they had, and leave believing their loved ones were receiving the best possible care. Meanwhile, Mariam was systematically starving these patients to death while stealing their money. But even her own nuns weren't safe from her wrath. Sister Theodoti made a fatal mistake. She spoke out against Mariam's cruel methods. In any normal religious community, raising concerns about patient care would be welcomed. But Mariam's monastery operated by different rules entirely. Mariam accused Sister Theodoti of misconduct and ordered the other nuns to beat her as punishment. Women who had taken vows of peace and compassion forced to brutally attack their sister or face the same fate themselves. They beat Sister Theodoti until she suffered internal hemorrhaging. She died on the spot, bleeding to death while Mariam watched, satisfied that her message was clear: question me and die. Sister Maria made the same mistake and paid the same price. When she arrived at the hospital, doctors couldn't recognize her. Internal bleeding, vital organs damaged beyond repair, beaten so severely that no medical treatment could save her life. These weren't isolated incidents of religious discipline gone wrong. This was systematic murder designed to maintain absolute control through terror. Now here's where things get even more twisted, because Mariam's crimes were about to expand beyond the monastery walls. The first crack in Mariam's perfect system came from an anonymous tip. Someone called police reporting that an elderly woman had donated all her property to the monastery, and her daughter was certain this wasn't voluntary. But Mariam had covered her tracks well. The property transfers looked legal. The death certificates were properly signed. On paper, everything appeared to be legitimate religious donations from devoted followers. Police initially charged her only with illegal imports, olive oil and spices brought in without proper documentation. For a woman who had murdered dozens of people and stolen millions of dollars, it was laughably insufficient. But investigators kept digging, and slowly, survivors began speaking up. Eugenia Margetta came forward with a story that made detectives' blood run cold. She had been held in isolation by Mariam, tortured until she surrendered property worth 118 million drachmas, equivalent to $80,000 in 1949. Then, Christos Spirits contacted police, searching for his missing 18-year-old daughter, Simula. He traced her back to the monastery and revealed that a nun named Mariam had convinced him to donate property worth $10,000. More disturbing, this nun had visited the United States to personally collect donated property. Mariam's operation wasn't just local, it was international. On the night of December 4th, 1950, 85 police officers surrounded the Convent of the Virgin in the Pines. They had anticipated finding evidence of murder and brought a deputy prosecutor, a judge, and a coroner with them. What they discovered inside was worse than anyone had imagined. They rescued 36 children who had to be physically removed from the nuns' grip. But that wasn't the most horrific discovery. In the basement cells, they found several half-naked, malnourished, sick elderly women tied up and left to die. These weren't patients receiving care. These were torture victims waiting for death. The search revealed the full scope of Mariam's crimes. At the time of her arrest, she had almost 300 homes and farms registered in her name, plus gold and jewels worth thousands of pounds. For a woman who had started life as a poor farm girl, this represented an impossible fortune built entirely on murder and theft. But even facing overwhelming evidence, Mariam refused to admit guilt. Mariam Soulakiotis faced 3 separate trials over several years. Throughout each one, she maintained her innocence, calling all charges against her satanic fictions. She wore Orthodox icons honoring the late Matthew, whom she had declared Saint Matthew, the new confessor. Her defense was as twisted as her crimes. Her attorney claimed that people who came to the monastery took vows of poverty voluntarily, willingly handing over all their property. He argued that assets were transferred to Mariam's name only because the monastery lacked proper legal structure. But prosecutors had built an airtight case. They indicted her for homicide, fraud, forgery of wills, blackmail, and torture. The evidence was overwhelming. witness statements, financial records, physical evidence of torture chambers, and survivor testimony that painted a clear picture of systematic murder. In 1951, she was convicted and sentenced to prison. Her followers held rallies demanding her release, still believing she was a holy woman being persecuted by jealous male church leaders. But Mariam's reign of terror was finally over. Mariam Soulakiotis was incarcerated in Averov prison in Athens, spending her final days as isolated as her victims had been. But unlike those she had tortured, she didn't suffer the same prolonged agony. She served only about a year of her 14-year sentence before falling ill. She died in the hospital at age 71, taking her secrets to the grave. The final tally of her crimes remains disputed. She was officially convicted for 7 murders, but authorities estimated she had killed at least 27 people through starvation, negligent homicide, and brutal beatings. Some investigators believe the real number was much higher, possibly over 170 victims. Almost 500 people had donated property to her monastery, and roughly the same number died there from disease, starvation, or torture.